Ethics by G.E. Moore. Quotes. Ethics by G.E. Moore is a foundational exploration of moral philosophy, presenting a detailed analysis of what makes actions right or wrong. In this book, Moore delves into various ethical theories, with a particular emphasis on utilitarianism, examining its claims about maximizing pleasure as the basis of moral decision-making. He presents a critical discussion of different philosophical positions regarding the nature of moral obligation, intrinsic value, and the objectivity of ethical judgments. This work also reflects on the complexities of moral responsibility, free will, and the relationship between right action and the greater good, offering insights into the broader implications of ethical conduct. Moore's analytical rigor and attention to fundamental ethical questions have made this work a significant contribution to moral philosophy. Quote 1. There is, moreover, a pretty general agreement with regard to certain things which happen in the world, that it would be better if they never happened, or, at least, did not happen so often as they do, and with regard to others, that it would be better if they happened more often than they do. This quote captures the general consensus that some events are universally seen as negative and should occur less, while others are viewed positively and should happen more frequently. The statement highlights the shared moral intuitions people have, even amid broader ethical disagreements. Quote 2. Ethical philosophers have, in fact, been largely concerned, not with laying down rules to the effect that certain ways of acting are generally or always right, and others generally or always wrong, nor yet with giving lists of things which are good and others which are evil, but with trying to answer more general and fundamental questions. Here, the author notes that ethics is not just about prescribing specific actions as right or wrong, but rather about investigating deeper, more abstract questions. These foundational inquiries aim to uncover the nature of moral concepts, like right and good. Quote 3. One great difficulty which arises in ethical discussions is the difficulty of getting quite clear as to exactly what question it is that we want to answer. This quote reflects the complexity of ethical debates. Often, philosophers face the challenge of clarifying what is being asked in moral inquiries before they can proceed to address the issue. This suggests that ambiguity in framing questions leads to much of the confusion in ethics. Quote 4. A voluntary action is right, whenever and only when no other action possible to the agent under the circumstances would have caused more pleasure. In all other cases, it is wrong. This assertion outlines a central principle of utilitarianism, where the moral value of an action depends on whether it maximizes pleasure. If another option would have produced more pleasure, then the action taken is deemed wrong. Quote 5. It is quite certain that we do hold that many voluntary actions are right and others wrong, that many ought to have been done and others ought not to have been done, and that it was the agent's duty to do some of them and his duty not to do others. This statement emphasizes the common moral belief that actions can be judged as either right or wrong, with certain actions being perceived as obligatory duties. It underlines the ethical expectation that people should act in ways aligned with these judgments. Quote 6. It recognizes, therefore, that there may be cases in which no single one of the actions open to the agent can be distinguished as the right one to do, that in many cases, on the contrary, several different actions may all be equally right. This quote addresses the idea that in some situations, multiple actions may all be equally right. In such cases, there is no single correct action to choose, which aligns with our everyday experience where different choices can be morally acceptable without one being better than the others. Quote 7. A characteristic which belongs to all right voluntary actions, and only to those which are right, is, it says, this, that they all cause at least as much pleasure as any action which the agent could have done instead. Or, in other words, they all produce a maximum of pleasure. Here, the author explains the utilitarian principle that right actions are those that maximize pleasure compared to any alternatives. This formulation is at the core of utilitarian ethics, emphasizing the importance of choosing actions that generate the greatest overall pleasure. Quote 8. But many of those who would be inclined to assent to this proposition would feel great hesitation in going on to assert that this is why actions are right or wrong, respectively. This statement highlights the distinction between recognizing that actions might produce more or less pleasure and asserting that the pleasure produced is the reason an action is right or wrong. This hesitation points to a more nuanced understanding of moral judgment beyond mere outcomes. Quote 9. Our theory asserts, then, in its second part, that voluntary actions are right when they are right, because they produce a maximum of pleasure. This quote reinforces the utilitarian view that the morality of an action is determined by its ability to produce the most pleasure. The theory moves beyond merely identifying right actions and claims that the reason they are right is directly linked to the pleasure they generate. Quote 10. It is, for instance, commonly held that some pleasures are higher or better than others, even though they may not be more pleasant, and that where we have a choice between procuring for ourselves or others a higher or a lower pleasure, it is generally right to prefer the former, even though it may perhaps be less pleasant. This quote touches on a common critique of utilitarianism, where some pleasures are considered inherently more valuable, even if they don't provide the same level of immediate satisfaction. It acknowledges the complexity of moral choices where quality, not just quantity, of pleasure matters. Quote 11. It asserts that, if any being whatever, in any circumstances whatever, had to choose between two actions, one of which would produce more pleasure than the other, it always would be his duty to choose the former rather than the latter, that this is absolutely unconditionally true. The quote claims that in every possible scenario, if an individual has a choice between two actions, they are morally obligated to choose the one that produces more pleasure. The principle is presented as universally applicable and unconditional, suggesting that the pursuit of greater pleasure is always the correct moral choice. Quote 12. To assert of any one thing, A, that it is intrinsically better than another, B, is to assert that if A existed quite alone, without any accompaniments or effects whatever, if, in short, A constituted the whole universe, it would be better that such a universe should exist than that a universe which consisted solely of B should exist instead. This statement explains what it means for one thing to be intrinsically better than another. It suggests that intrinsic value is determined by whether it would be preferable for that thing to exist on its own, without any external influences or consequences, than for another thing to exist under the same conditions. Quote 13. It asserts, first of all, that they have a unique relation to right and wrong, and secondly, that they have a unique relation to intrinsic value. This quote highlights that pleasure and pain are assigned a special status in both moral judgments of right and wrong and in assessments of intrinsic value. The theory emphasizes that these two concepts, moral rightness and intrinsic value, are fundamentally connected to the quantities of pleasure and pain involved. Quote 14. It only says that none of them would have any value if they existed quite alone. But of course, as a matter of fact, none of them do exist quite alone, and hence it may quite consistently allow that, as it is, many of them do have very great value. This statement acknowledges that while things other than pleasure and pain might not have intrinsic value on their own, they often hold value in real-world contexts because they are never found in isolation. It points out the distinction between intrinsic and contextual value, allowing for the possibility that many things are valuable in practice, even if not intrinsically. Quote 15. The proposition that is true of intrinsic value is not, it holds, true of value of any other kind. The theory claims that intrinsic value operates according to specific rules, distinct from other types of value. Only intrinsic value, it argues, is tied directly to moral rightness and wrongness in a precise way, while other forms of value do not follow the same moral logic. Quote 16. It implied also, too, that the same action cannot possibly at the same time be both right and wrong. The author asserts that a single action cannot be simultaneously right and wrong. This statement challenges any relativistic views that suggest moral judgments could be subjective or vary over time for the same action. It upholds the idea that moral truths, once determined, are constant. Quote 17. It holds, as we have seen, that the question whether an action is right or wrong depends upon its effects, and the question what effects an action will produce depends, of course, not only upon the class to which it belongs, but also on the particular circumstances in which it is done. This quote highlights the theory's emphasis on the consequences of actions in determining their moral status. The author stresses that actions are not judged solely by their type, but by the specific outcomes they produce in given circumstances, which can vary, making some actions right in one situation and wrong in another. Quote 18. If we decided in the affirmative, then a great many of the questions which have been most discussed by ethical writers are at once put out of court. The statement suggests that if we accept that an action can be both right and wrong, it would undermine many long-held debates in ethical philosophy. This would dismiss attempts to define a single characteristic that distinguishes right actions from wrong ones, thereby shifting the framework of moral inquiry. Quote 19. If, whenever I judge an action to be right, I am merely judging that I myself have a particular feeling towards it, then it plainly follows that, provided I really have the feeling in question, my judgment is true, and therefore the action in question really is right. This quote reflects a subjective view of morality, where the truth of a moral judgment is based solely on personal feelings. The statement highlights the problematic nature of such a view, as it leads to the conclusion that any action could be deemed right if the person making the judgment feels positively about it, regardless of broader considerations. Quote 20. If, when one man says, "This action is right," and another answers, "No, it is not right," each of them is always merely making an assertion about his own feelings. It plainly follows that there is never really any difference of opinion between them. The author points out the logical inconsistency in a purely subjective view of moral judgments. If each person's moral claim is only about their own feelings, then disagreements about right and wrong would be meaningless, because no one would be contradicting anyone else. This undermines the idea of moral debate or genuine conflict in ethical opinions. Quote 21. It may be alleged to be a fact that whenever a man judges an action to be right, he only does so because he has a certain feeling towards it, and this alleged fact may actually be used as an argument to prove that what he is judging is merely that he has the feeling. The author is pointing out that even if a person only judges an action to be right because they have a feeling towards it, it does not logically follow that the judgment itself is only about their feelings. The distinction here is crucial, as it separates the cause of a judgment from the content of the judgment itself, allowing for the possibility that moral judgments are about something other than just emotions. Quote 22. It follows, therefore, from any view of this type, that whenever any man has, or has not, some particular feeling towards an action, the action is right, and also that whenever any man has, or has not, some particular feeling towards an action, the action is wrong. This statement outlines the consequence of the subjective view of morality, where rightness or wrongness depends on individual feelings. If this view holds, then an action can be both right and wrong depending on who is judging it, which introduces inconsistency and undermines the stability of moral judgments. Quote 23. The objection is again merely one of psychological fact, resting upon observation of what actually happens when a man thinks an action to be right or wrong. Here, the author bases an objection on real-world observation, noting that people often make moral judgments without reference to their society's approval or their personal feelings. This demonstrates that judgments of right and wrong are not necessarily tied to external feelings or societal norms, but may be based on other factors. Quote 24. If rightness is not the same thing as the having a relation to the feelings of any man or set of men, it would be a curious coincidence if any such relation were invariably a sign of rightness. This quote challenges the idea that feelings or societal approval can be a reliable indicator of moral rightness. If moral rightness is distinct from people's feelings, it would be strange to suggest that feelings always align with what is right, further questioning subjective or relativistic approaches to morality. Quote 25. But no argument from the origin of a thing can be a safe guide as to exactly what the nature of the thing is now. This assertion rejects the idea that just because moral judgments might have originated from emotional responses or societal norms, they must still be tied to those origins today. The nature of moral judgments, as they exist now, must be examined independently of their historical development, and assumptions based on origins are unreliable. Quote 26. If we only hold the tenable view that no man ever knows an action to be right or wrong, but can only think it to be so, then, so far from implying the untenable view that to assert an action to be right or wrong is the same thing as to assert that we think it to be so, we imply the direct opposite of this. This quote explains that while it may be true that no one can ever truly know whether an action is right or wrong, this does not mean that asserting something is right or wrong is simply expressing one's personal belief about it. The distinction lies in the fact that moral judgments are not merely statements about belief, but involve deeper claims about the nature of the action itself. Quote 27. They have assumed that the question whether an action is right cannot be completely settled by showing that any man or set of men have certain feelings or opinions about it. This statement highlights the distinction between moral judgments and personal feelings or opinions. The author points out that many ethicists hold that determining whether an action is right cannot simply rely on how people feel about it, implying that morality has an objective dimension that transcends individual or collective sentiments. Quote 28. If these views were true, the whole business of ethics, in this department, would merely consist in discovering what feelings and opinions men have actually had about different actions, and why they have had them. Here the author suggests that if morality were purely about people's feelings and opinions, ethics would be reduced to a form of psychology or anthropology. Instead of seeking to understand what is right or wrong, ethics would merely study human attitudes toward actions, which would undermine the deeper inquiries that ethical theory typically involves. Quote 29. But yet, they are called commandments, and if we look at what they actually say, we find such expressions as, "Thou shalt do no murder," "Thou shalt not steal," expressions which are obviously equivalent to the imperatives, "Do no murder," "Do not steal," and which strictly, therefore, should express commands. This statement refers to the notion that moral laws, such as commandments, often take the form of commands. This suggests that moral imperatives might be seen as expressions of what we ought to do, adding a sense of authority or obligation to moral judgments, much like legal commands within a society. Quote 30. But still it may be true that there always is some person or set of persons whose will or consent is necessary to make a law a law. This quote explains the concept that the existence of laws, in a legal or moral sense, may depend on the will or authority of certain individuals or groups. It points out the role of human will in establishing laws, but this does not necessarily imply that moral laws are similarly dependent on human or non-human will. Quote 31. The argument is simply that, whether there is such a being or not, there certainly are many people who do not believe that there is one, and that such people, in spite of not believing in its existence, can nevertheless continue to believe that actions are right and wrong. Here, the author argues that belief in moral right and wrong does not require belief in a non-human being, such as God, who commands or forbids actions. The existence of moral judgments among those who do not believe in such beings shows that morality is not inherently tied to divine will. Quote 32. They imply this because they imply that if the non-human being, whom they suppose to exist, did not exist, nothing would be right or wrong. This quote critiques the idea that moral judgments depend on the existence of a non-human being. It asserts that if morality were based solely on the will of such a being, then in the absence of this being, there would be no moral framework which challenges the independence of moral values from divine or authoritative commands. Quote 33. To predicate of an action that it is right or wrong is to predicate of it something quite different from the mere fact that any man or set of men have any particular feeling towards or opinion about it. This statement emphasizes that moral judgments about right and wrong are not simply reflections of people's feelings or opinions. The act of declaring something right or wrong is a distinct moral evaluation, separate from subjective human reactions. Quote 34. We are not now urging that anything would be any good at all, unless somebody had some feeling towards something, nor are we urging that there are not many things which are good, in one sense of the word, and which yet would not be any good at all unless somebody had some feeling towards them. The author acknowledges that certain things may only have value if they elicit feelings from someone. However, this does not undermine the broader point that moral goodness can exist independently of individual attitudes or emotions. The distinction being made here is between intrinsic value and value dependent on external feelings. Quote 35. All of them are directed against the view that right and wrong do always depend upon an action's actual consequences or results. This quote addresses the primary focus of the objections discussed in the chapter. The idea that moral rightness or wrongness is always determined by the outcomes or consequences of an action. The objections aim to challenge the reliance on results as the sole criterion for moral judgment, arguing for alternative factors like motives or the nature of the action itself. Quote 36. It seems to me to be self-evident that knowingly to do an action which would make the world, on the whole, really and truly worse than if we had acted differently, must always be wrong. This statement argues that if an action results in a world that is objectively worse than if another choice had been made, it must be considered morally wrong. The author asserts this principle as self-evident, emphasizing that moral choices should be guided by their actual impact on the overall state of the world. Quote 37. Those who say that certain rules ought absolutely always to be obeyed, whatever the consequences may be, are logically bound to deny this. Here, the author critiques the view that moral rules should be followed unconditionally, regardless of their consequences. The claim is that those who argue for strict adherence to rules, irrespective of outcomes, must reject the idea that consequences matter, which contradicts the broader ethical principle that outcomes are key to determining right and wrong. Quote 38. It is quite certain that when a man does an action which has bad consequences from a good motive, we do tend to judge him differently from a man who does a similar action from a bad one. This quote reflects the common moral intuition that motives matter when evaluating a person's actions. Even when the outcomes are negative, we tend to judge individuals less harshly if their intentions were good, as opposed to someone who acted with bad motives, regardless of the consequences. Quote 39. We hardly ever, if ever, know for certain which among the courses open to us will produce the best consequences. This statement highlights the uncertainty involved in predicting the outcomes of our actions. The author points out that we often make decisions based on what we believe will produce the best results, but unforeseen events can affect those outcomes, complicating the moral evaluation of actions based purely on consequences. Quote 40. It assumes, therefore, that wherever a voluntary action is right or wrong, and we have throughout only been talking of voluntary actions, it is true that the agent could, in a sense, have done something else instead. This quote highlights the assumption that moral judgments about right and wrong apply to voluntary actions, where the agent could have made a different choice. It emphasizes that the possibility of choosing differently is central to determining moral responsibility in voluntary actions. Quote 41. Those who hold that no man ever could have done anything other than what he did do are, if they also hold that right and wrong depend upon what we can do, logically bound to hold that no action of ours is ever right, and none is ever wrong. This statement points out the logical consequence for those who believe in determinism, the idea that no one could have done anything differently than they did. If this belief is combined with the idea that moral responsibility depends on what we can do, it leads to the conclusion that moral judgments of right and wrong become impossible, undermining the concept of moral responsibility. Quote 42. The statement that we have free will is certainly ordinarily understood to imply that we really sometimes have the power of acting differently from the way in which we actually do act. This quote clarifies that the common understanding of free will involves the ability to choose and act differently than one does in reality. It underscores that, without this power to act differently, the notion of free will, as it is typically understood, would be meaningless. Quote 43. It is impossible to exaggerate the frequency of the occasions on which we all of us make a distinction between two things, neither of which did happen, a distinction which we express by saying that whereas the one could have happened, the other could not. Here, the author explains that we constantly make distinctions between what could have happened and what could not, even when neither event actually took place. This widespread and intuitive use of language shows that people often operate under the assumption that certain outcomes were possible, even though they did not occur. Quote 44. There is, therefore, much reason to think that when we say that we could have done a thing which we did not do, we often mean merely that we should have done it if we had chosen. This statement suggests that when people say they could have acted differently, they often mean that they would have done so if they had chosen to. It reflects the idea that the possibility of different outcomes is often tied to the choices we make, reaffirming the connection between free will and decision-making. Quote 45. To say that any one thing or state of things is intrinsically good or intrinsically bad, or that one is intrinsically better than another, is also not the same thing as to say that any being or set of beings has towards it any mental attitude whatever, either an attitude of feeling or of desiring or of thinking something about it. This quote emphasizes that intrinsic value is independent of any feelings, desires, or thoughts that beings might have towards a thing. It asserts that whether something is intrinsically good or bad is not determined by subjective attitudes, but is an objective characteristic of the thing itself. Quote 46. It must always be our duty to do what will produce the best effects upon the whole, no matter how bad the effects upon ourselves may be, and no matter how much good we ourselves may lose by it. Here, the author affirms the ethical principle that individuals have a duty to prioritize the greater good, even at the cost of their own personal welfare. The statement stresses the importance of considering the collective consequences of actions over personal gain. Quote 47. The total results of an action always depend, not merely on the specific nature of the action, but on the circumstances in which it is done. This quote suggests that the morality of an action cannot be judged solely by the action itself. Instead, the consequences depend on the specific circumstances surrounding the action, indicating that moral judgments must take context into account. Quote 48. It seems to me quite self-evident that it must always be our duty to do what will produce the best effects upon the whole, no matter how bad the effects upon ourselves may be, and no matter how much good we ourselves may lose by it. This reiterates the idea that individuals have an ethical responsibility to act in a way that benefits the greater good, regardless of personal sacrifice. The author presents this duty as a self-evident truth, underscoring its moral importance. Quote 49. Is it true that one whole will be intrinsically better than another, whenever and only when it contains more pleasure, no matter what the two may be like in other respects? This quote questions the idea that intrinsic value is solely based on the amount of pleasure something contains. It challenges the reduction of intrinsic value to a simple calculation of pleasure, suggesting that other qualities, such as knowledge or beauty, might also play a significant role in determining what is intrinsically better. Quote 50. It involves our saying, for instance, that a world in which absolutely nothing except pleasure existed, no knowledge, no love, no enjoyment of beauty, no moral qualities, must yet be intrinsically better, better worth creating, provided only the total quantity of pleasure in it were the least bit greater than one in which all these things existed, as well as pleasure. This quote challenges the notion that pleasure alone determines intrinsic value. It presents a hypothetical world where only pleasure exists and contrasts it with one rich in knowledge, love, beauty, and moral qualities, suggesting that intrinsic value cannot be solely tied to pleasure, as such a view would absurdly favor the pleasure-only world. Quote 51. It does follow that we must be wrong in thinking that by adding such things as knowledge or a sense of beauty to a world which contained a certain amount of pleasure, without adding any more pleasure, we could increase the intrinsic value of that world. This statement critiques the idea that the intrinsic value of a world can only be increased by adding pleasure. It argues that valuable elements like knowledge or beauty contribute to a world's worth, even if they don't directly increase pleasure, rejecting a purely pleasure-based evaluation of value. Quote 52. It seems quite clear that the degree of intrinsic value of a whole is not always in proportion to the quantity of pleasure it contains. Here, the author asserts that intrinsic value does not align perfectly with the amount of pleasure present. This highlights the complexity of value, suggesting that factors other than pleasure, such as relationships, beauty, or moral elements, also contribute to the intrinsic worth of something. Quote 53. The fact is that the view which seems to me to be true is the one which, apart from theories, I think everyone would naturally take, namely, that there are an immense variety of different things, all of which are intrinsically good. This quote reflects the belief that a broad range of things can be intrinsically good, including diverse elements such as knowledge, beauty, or moral virtues. The author suggests that intrinsic value is not limited to a single factor like pleasure, but encompasses a variety of valuable qualities. Quote 54. Nothing is commoner than to find people asking of a good thing, "What use is it?" and concluding that, if it is no use, it cannot be any good. This quote criticizes the tendency to equate usefulness with intrinsic goodness. The author points out the common mistake of dismissing something's intrinsic value just because it does not serve a practical purpose, underscoring the distinction between being good in itself and being useful. Ethics, by G.E. Moore, concludes by reaffirming the importance of critically evaluating the criteria by which we judge actions as right or wrong. Moore presents a pluralistic view, emphasizing that moral judgments are not solely about maximizing pleasure, but are tied to a broader understanding of intrinsic value, which can include multiple goods beyond mere pleasure. His analysis challenges readers to think deeply about the foundations of ethical theory, considering not just the outcomes of actions, but the moral principles that underlie them. Moore's exploration of the objective nature of ethical truths and his critique of subjectivist and non-cognitivist theories enrich our understanding of the complexity and nuance required in ethical deliberation.
Curious to dive into the mind of G.E. Moore? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of ethics in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.